So Riane, as always, it's really a joy to meet with you again as we have numerous times through the years. And I'm excited to talk to you about your body of work, what's new and interesting, as it always is with what you're doing at the Center for Partnership Systems. And particularly, we're going to talk a bit, but we'll get into that a little later, of the power of partnership podcasts that have
Yeah.
recently emerged. And I had the pleasure of being on one of the early podcasts. And as you well remember, you and I have known each other, I think, since about 1987, when your really iconic now book, The Chalice and the Blade, was first published. And I met you in San Francisco, and we talked about our work and our various books, and we've been colleagues and friends ever since. So we've been doing this work, both of us, for quite a long time now.
Yes, and I think that persistence is both of our middle names.
Indeed. So just to start, let me just ask you how you're doing at
I'm
this time of your life, and what excites you as we are entering, as always, some very interesting, challenging times.
well, I'll tell you, I'm first of all, and I should have done this before, I am putting my um, phones, I'm turning them
Oh,
off.
good.
And I'm really doing okay considering everything that's going on in the world, which, of course, I'm saddened and disturbed by. Um, but I seem to still have energy to pursue my work. I'm still mourning the death of my beloved David, my partner and husband. We were together for 45 years, and that's a long time. We were sort of a world unto ourselves. So I'm trying to adjust to that.
Yes.
And I am so glad to be with you because the work that you are doing is so important. And it is really a fundamental part of what I call the shift from domination to partnership, redefining masculinity, because it's really humanity that we're talking about, isn't it?
It
And
truly
both
is.
women and men share that.
It absolutely is, and that's really where you and I first connected back in the day, when at a time when so many women, particularly working in the field, feminist women, really saw this kind of discrepancy between males and females, and often either that we didn't connect at all, or males somehow in the patriarchy were to blame. And you're one of the certainly early people that really recognized that it wasn't men that were the problem, or women that were the problem, but the system that we all are within. And you defined really obviously clear, relevant then, and even more so now, the distinction between the partnership and the domination model. And you've written numerous books, which I've read all and have benefited from all of them. But as a psychotherapist, and my day-to-day work is with individual men and women and couples, I really was taken by and influenced by the book that you wrote that's called The Power of Partnership. Just hold it up here for a minute, because I want to talk to you a bit about it. And the subtitle is Seven Relationships That Will Change Your Life. And I want to just introduce it with a little bit from the introduction, which you will, I'm sure, remember, but many people don't know this part of your life unless they remember and read this book. But I'll just read this little section. It's from the introduction, which you call The Adventure of Change. And you say, 25 years ago, I stood at a turning point. I had to rethink everything about my life. I was a single mother of two children, working as a family attorney, doing research, writing, lecturing, looking for the life companion I yearned for, grieving over the death of both my parents, not getting enough sleep, not paying attention to what I ate, pushing myself until I nearly collapsed. And you've come a long way since then. And I wonder if you could share a little bit about both what what your life was at that point when you wrote that, and how that particular book came to be, and particularly you mentioned seven relationship uh, patterns and processes, and I'd like you to speak to the first three that you mentioned, which um, are your relationship with yourself, which often people neglect, your relationship with an intimate partner or relationship, and then your work and community. So all of that, I think, is tremendously important, and would like to have you elaborate a bit on those areas, if you will.
I'd be delighted to. Well, how the book came to be is that I wanted to provide um, a practical application of my findings, of my multidisciplinary, cross-cultural research. And so I wrote this book, and as you know, at the end of each chapter, there are these really things that you can do as a reader. Uh, Next steps, going further, etc. So where I was at that point in my life, I was already with David, of course. I uh, did uh, find my life partner, and he was an amazing, uh, wonderful, quirky. I loved his quirks. A poet. Um, he was really, and I was ready for that. See, I think that David always remarked that if we had met earlier, perhaps we wouldn't. I mean, he would have liked, he claimed, but that I was in another place.
Mm,
And indeed, the book is about personal transformation from domination to partnership. Uh, and I think that this transformation is not only possible personally, because I've experienced it, but socially. And so one of the points of the book is that there was a lot of emphasis on self-help at that time. And indeed, you know that this book won the Nautilus Award as the best self-help book of the year, even though if you go to the other relationships, which we will, they're really not part of the conventional self-help.
mm.
Um, but well, you asked me to talk about the first three of these, so I'll just go on.
Yes,
I
please.
I think that we rarely think about a relationship with ourselves, but actually we all have a relationship with ourselves. Um, and we have inherited in that relationship a lot from domination traditions. You know, you're not good enough, comparing ourselves, being ashamed, uh, you know, the panoply. And that it wasn't invented by our parents, by the way. And I make that point because they were just transferring what they had learned.
Mm.
And I think one of the really wonderful things that's happening today is how many parents and caregivers are re-examining that relationship and shifting from an authoritarian and often violent
Mm.
way of, you know, spanking is violence.
Yeah.
It's violence against somebody who's bigger and stronger, against somebody who is weaker and smaller. And yet you talk to people about violence and they talk about war only. I taught a course at the University of Alabama online, and there were these young women, African American women, who claimed, and I mean, it shocked me at the time, that using a switch to discipline children is not violence, that it's really a family tradition.
Mhm.
And I couldn't, I just couldn't believe my ears. So if we move more towards the partnership side, we can have actually, yes, there is that inner critic, and that inner critic is there to protect us in some ways.
Mhm.
But we need to make peace with that inner critic and tell it to kind of, whoa, stop. And if you can't stop, just whisper instead of yelling at me. So a lot of the first chapter deals with how most of us have internalized
Mhm.
this inner critic. And of course, it's an essential part of what happens to children in domination-oriented families, because it's the socialization of both girls and boys and everyone in between
Mhm.
to fit into a domination system and to really obedience, that's the big deal, rather than reflection, rather than creativity, conformity. And I think that certainly we have to conform to certain rules, and that's why the difference between authoritarian and authoritative
Mhm.
that's emerging now. And so many people, especially younger people, but also older ones,
Mhm.
are beginning to see the difference. And I want to close with that part. I make the point in that book that in the 60s, when we first, this explosion of consciousness, including the consciousness of women, which I didn't even have, uh, you know, um, happened, we often mistook rebellion for reconstruction.
Mhm.
And this book is really about not so much rebellion as reconstruction,
Mhm.
as is my work.
That's wonderful. And it was so, like so many of the books that you've written have, for me at least, and I think for a lot of people, really said things that nobody else was saying or were saying 20 years ahead of the time or 30 or 40. And I remember reading this book when it came out and just being astonished by the thinking of putting together not only the partnership and dominator paradigm and how it impacts our view of ourselves, our relationships with our partners, and our relationship and work in the world. And more recently, there's an author and poet, David White, who wrote a book called The Three Marriages. And he makes a similar point that you made much earlier, which was he said that we all have to attend to what he called three marriages. And he says the first one is what we traditionally call a marriage to a significant partner. And he's second one, he said, which often is problematic, is our relationship to our work, that is a long-term, ongoing commitment. And then he said this kind of less known relationship or marriage to ourselves. And he goes into some depth about what that means. And said not only those three and then others beyond that. So it was just, I think, stunning and really prescient in your understanding. And what you talk about that marriage to a partner, which I think we all either feel gifted if we've had I've been with Carlin together now for 45 years, and we're still together and alive and loving. And I remember having known you for a while. I had the good opportunity to meet David many years ago when you were doing a talk up in my area of Northern California. And I went down, you needed a ride, you and David, and I went down and picked you both up, and you got to know him. And he and I stayed in touch after we met. And he sent me a number of his books. He was a very, as you well know, prolific writer and creator and so on. And among the books he sent me was this book, which I have and love, and you well know it. It's called 3,000 Years of Love, The Life of Riane Eisler and David Lowy. Um, it's a
It's
beautiful
Lloyd.
book. All his books were both beautiful and full of love. And I see your smile as you see it, and I'm sure remember it. I wanted
Wow.
to read a little bit from it. Did you have something you
Please.
wanted to say about it before I do that?
Well, first of all, I wanted to say it's David Loy, Loye.
Okay.
And but of course I know this book, and I love not only David's poetry, he wrote me so much poetry, but also his prose. He was so funny.
Yeah.
I mean, he was just amazing. But please read from it.
Well, what struck me, as you do, he doesn't waste words. He jumps right in. And this was in the first chapter. It's called "How We Almost Didn't Meet."
Oh, he told that story. So, I mean, it's a funny story.
You would probably have some additional things, but I'll read what David said in part, and I could go on and read the whole thing. I'd love it. But he says, "I am now 82. Looking back at that early time and how it was then. So driven by joy was I that all I had to do to write a poem a day for our first 3 months together was to find and form the first line in my head, and the rest rolled out like a child released from school for summer vacation or a colt to the open pasture." He says, "As for our love, what can I say? She was 46. I was 52. We had both had first marriages, mine for 25 years, hers for 15 years. We had we had children, two for her, four for me." And then he goes on. And when I read that, and I've since reflected on it, how in some ways similar to your life and mine and Carlin. Carlin and I also met in midlife and had been married before. I had two children that I brought into the relationship. She had three, and then our, children and grandchildren have rolled out from there. But it was such a wonderful beginning, and then the book and all his energy and kindness and creativity and I think you and I both could probably talk for many many hours about his work and your relationship. But I'd like anything you'd like to say about that opening and that beginning and kind of where it went. And also, not only clearly it has impacted your personal life, and you say very heartfelt, both the life you have been in all those years and the loss when he died. But I know it's impacted your writing and your partnership at work in the world that may not be obvious to people that may not know your personal part of that life.
God, I don't even know where to begin, but I'll begin with something very personal, which is that I really know that real partnership is possible, and that it is joyful, and that it is so much better than the conventional marriage of husband and wife. and I very purposely put the wife
Yeah, right.
down because as in the English common law, the husband and the wife are one, and the one is the husband. And that sums it up.
Yeah.
Um, but David and I, well, first of all, we were inseparable from the day that we first met.
Mhm.
And that day, by the way, um, he drove uh, back to my house and put his first poem to me in the mailbox. Um, and I saw it the next day, and it was so beautiful. And he came over, and that was, and I learned so much about him. He was the only man who could play Beethoven's Ode to Joy, from the fifth on a 1-inch harmonica. I mean, he was something. He loved music. Um, he knew so much about music, about art, about nature, really. Um, but in terms of my work, I really don't think that I was already working on the chalice and the blade when I met David. Um, but he was invaluable. It was like he had a PhD, as you know, in psychology. It was a social psychology that his specialty was. And it was like having an in-house mentor,
Mhm.
really, on just about everything that I wanted to know. Um, and he was a fabulous, he wouldn't let me edit, but he was a really fabulous editor. I mean, he was a fabulous man. And I highly, highly recommend not only 3,000 Years of Love, which is a lovely book. And I won't give away why the title 3,000 Years of Love. Um, but he was a pioneer in reinterpreting Darwin, who, as David put it, has been used as this 800-pound gorilla to maintain domination systems and completely misinterpreted. Uh, and, a lot of people are beginning to recognize this today, but David was really the first. And he did a word search, because that's available to us now. And he found that in the book that Darwin wrote about human evolution, and he made it very clear that he said, this book now is about human evolution. Um, he absolutely uh, highlighted those qualities that we have that really make us very much yearn for what I call caring connection.
Right.
The qualities of caring and consciousness and creativity. And he even wrote about morality, moral sensitivity. And David later wrote a great deal about what he called partnership moral sensitivity and dominator moral insensitivity. And if you really, and I draw from that actually in this book, The Power of Partnership. Um, and we had and I shared that in the chapter on our intimate and family relationships. Um, it was a method that we adapted from co-counseling,
Mm. I
where
didn't
instead
realize
of
that.
going to
That's
see a
great.
psychologist, it's a peer-to-peer
Right.
methodology, but we adapted it for when we really needed to talk about something. And of course, the rule was you use I feel and not you did, because, that, yeah,
Right.
you start being defensive right away. also, we use the fact, as is common practice in co-counseling, that when one person is speaking, the person who calls for the session or whose session it is, the other person cannot interrupt. And, we are so eager, aren't we, to get a word in edgewise, but you can't in a session. And I shared that method because it really helped us when
Mm.
we were, uh, and everybody fights. I mean, I want to go to bed, you want to go to a movie. I mean, right there, there's conflict, but how you deal with conflict, that is very, very different in a domination or a partnership system. And it's really a partnership domination scale.
Right.
It's a matter of degree, just as light and dark in nature is a matter of degree, just as hot and cold in nature is a matter of degree. We do have these polarities. Uh, and really, I think that if having that relationship and David encouraging me and supporting me and helping me was a huge, huge gift that I received from our relationship.
Yeah, and it's a gift that keeps on giving because I don't know if this is true for everybody, but I know as a psychologist and as a marriage and family therapist, I know that in many ways, it's difficult, maybe impossible to have the kind of, intimacy that develops once you're a little more mature, and I talk about in kind of my model that I say that we really don't even start to become our own selves until we get into our either late 30s or early 40s. And so we have this idea somehow we form a partnership, we get married, and often not only are we immature just because we haven't lived that long, but because we've picked up so many parts of the dominator system through, as you talk about in numerous books, through eons, through, hundreds, thousands of years, that even at best, we have a lot to clean out and we don't have the systems and the structure for being able to heal until we get to be midlife. And I think you and David were just wonderful examples. And I'm really glad to be able to highlight both his work and yours and the relationship that both lived with and now continue to expand into the world. So that kind of leads into for me the podcasts, the power of partnership, and why, at least from my side, these podcasts feel so immediately relevant is that it extends partnership into all areas of our world, as it always has been for you, but we, as time goes on, we use different medium to be able to get the word out, from books to podcasts to various methods. And I just wonder if you could talk a bit about the idea for the power of partnership podcasts, how they came to be, what you've done so far, and what you see with these as you unroll them now into the next phases of your work and your life.
Well, I first want to acknowledge Cherry Jacobs Pruitt, who is the interviewer who interviewed you, who interviewed me, who interviewed all kinds of people who are in one way or another applying, using the partnership domination social scale. And I think it's a very important podcast um, because it shows what you mentioned, that it's a systems approach, that it covers all aspects of families, of our economy, of our society, of life. Um, I think that the interviews, well, your interview is certainly a very important one. Um, Sherry has interviewed Lila June, who is a Native American, who found that my analysis of indigenous European societies and indigenous so-called Native American societies um, are, have so many parallels,
Mm,
including a very different construction because they oriented more to the partnership side of the continuing, a very different construction of gender roles and
mm.
relations. And, you know, we are in a time when people are really grappling with that, aren't they? Both women and, thank goodness, men.
Yeah,
Because I mean, as the power of partnership and all of my work shows, uh, it's yes, men have more privilege in domination systems, and there's the normative ideal of the punitive, you know, wait till your father gets home, male head of household. But men don't have it so good in domination systems. For one thing, uh, well, look at Putin. You know, he wants more real estate. So all of these Russian men under this authoritarian, highly punitive, violent, rigidly male-dominated system have to give their lives just because this guy on top wants more real estate.
yeah.
I mean, and that's been really the history that we have been taught and taught and taught, idealizing so-called nobility, which were, you know, the big sport of the nobility in the European Middle Ages was to go next door and lay siege and plunder and kill your neighbor's castle. I mean, that's what the feudal times,
Yeah.
oh, the good old days, right, were all about. Um, there's so much to say. And once you start really looking at our lives and our past and our present and the possibilities for our future using this new frame, uh, everything falls in place, you know?
It
I mean,
does.
for me, it really did. But I'm so glad to hear you say that also. And that's what the people who are in, you know, who are doing, we're now going into our second year of the power of the pop, power of partnership
Mhm.
podcast. And we've, Sherry has interviewed um, people who do couples work, um, people who uh, work on the environment, people who work. Uh, I mean, it just affects our personal lives, but it also affects our work lives and our community lives. And you are.
Indeed. Yeah, you mentioned Putin and what we see in really in the world of male warfare. And unfortunately, it isn't just going on in the Russian part of the world. There are dominator males, seems to be a more common experience of the male psyche, and we see it in our own country in some ways. We see it in many other countries where authoritarian leaders, not only take over. And you mentioned that not only those kind of practices are destructive, create death and destruction for everybody, but the males who are in those roles also are harmful to themselves. And, our moonshot for mankind, which I've been working with Men Alive and drawing together organizations that recognize that not only is the male violence that is directed outwardly part of this dominator way of being, but it's turned inward in the form of higher suicide rates for males. 4 to 15 times higher suicide rates for males at every age group. And as males get older, the suicide rate is much higher than it is for females of the same age. Males get diseases and higher rates of destructive self-behavior. So the privilege is a false privilege in a way. You know, the privilege of being able to take over territory is not the privilege that makes for a happier and more productive life. And I'd like to just kind of ask you, because you're in a kind of unique position to talk about men and the value of the healing that men need to do. It's been my life's work. And I wonder, with your long experience with David, and clearly a man of partnership and ability to develop and maintain a loving partnership, do you have anything to say about what you know about David and maybe other men that you've known that have been able to, actualize that? How did it come to be for him? Do you have a good family to grow up with? Any insights into how, this man in your life was able to provide the kind of partnership, co-creation that you spent 45 years with?
Well, David's father was the head of the America First Party in Bartlesville, Oklahoma, which is a very wealthy oil town. But David, from the get-go, uh, and I think part of it had to do with how intelligent David was.
Mm,
And we have studies of how gifted children tend to be more morally sensitive.
mm,
But for whatever reason, David rejected those values
mm,
very early on. And now his first book to be published and to gain actually wide recognition um, won the Anisfield Wolf Award, earlier given to Martin Luther King Jr. as the best book on race relations of that year. It was called Healing of a Nation, The Healing of a Nation. And David was not a feminist. I mean, that book is full of he and the man and all of the sexist language that is, quote, meant to be inclusive. But, it's like the common laws. That one is the he, the husband,
right.
right? But he was open. And through me at that time, I mean, he learned a lot from me.
Mm,
And he came to the conclusion, which he expressed in the one panel for men at the 1985 Women's Conference of the United Nations in Nairobi, which we both attended.
mm,
He was in the one panel on what men can do to support women.
mm,
He felt that the women's movement was one of the most, if not the most important movement um, of modern times in terms of the shift
mm-hmm,
of really of paradigm and of systems from domination to partnership. Um, I mean, David was amazing in his capacity for really caring.
mm,
It was so caring to me. I mean, what I'm trying to express is what you know, that caring is not, I mean, it's coded feminine, right, in domination system, but it's a human quality.
exactly.
And we love, it's very interesting because we not only get endorphins, chemical rewards of pleasure when we are loved, but when we love another,
Right.
when we care for another, be it a spouse, be it a child, be it a friend, be it a pet. I mean, we are predisposed. And my newest book, by the way, which came out in 2019 with Oxford University Press, Nurturing Our Humanity,
Yeah,
draws very heavily, as you know, from neuroscience,
yeah,
and really, really showing that the story that we've been told about human nature, and yes, divided into man's nature and woman's nature, is absolutely false. It's a lie. And we have to challenge that story, not only for the sake of women, but for the sake of men and children of all genders, frankly. And yes, the rigidity of these gender stereotypes, whether it's in the Taliban or Iran, Eastern religious, or whether it's a Western religious society like the rightist, so-called rightist fundamentalist alliance, or whether it's in Putin's Russia, a secular society, or whether it really doesn't matter whether it's rightist or leftist or
right,
Eastern or Western. Uh, these are patterns, and the
exactly.
construction of gender roles and relations uh, is a fundamental principle of family, social, and economic organization. And that's not what we are taught.
Exactly right. And early on, and I think a couple of points you make, I think are worth underlining. One is that um, David's background, my background, so many men's background, has been sexist, and we are children of the times we grew up in, and the parents who raised us, and so on. But we can learn. I mean, I remember reading the early feminist writings, and it just immediately was clear. Well, that's me too. I mean, it isn't just women that have been put in a restrictive box. That was me in my own way, and I can learn from the women. And went to feminist rallies and married a feminist. And I think what you said then, and is still true now. I mean, love is human. The kinds of partnership is not gender based, only for men or only for women. It's for all of us. And that's what your work over these many years and mine has been. And, I'm, now in my 80s and continuing on to do the work that I do. And I know you're continuing. Is there anything more you would like to add about anything that's coming up for you beyond? We'll let people
Oh,
know about the Power of Partnership podcasts and Cherry's work and some of the other things that are new. Anything else you'd like to let us know about
yes,
before we wrap
yes,
up?
yes, I would. In my work, and it has been progressing, I've learned and I continue to learn. Um, I have come to the conclusion that there are four cornerstones that those pushing us back to more rigid strongman rule, uh, you know, we see it in our own country, we see it all over the world today because it this is a difficult time, and people either want to go back, or there are many of us who want to go forward. And that's the good part. That's the struggle, really. And it isn't between capitalism and socialism. That's a complete distraction because, well, I'm going to be nonlinear. So I'm working on a number of things.
Mhm.
For one thing, uh, I have come through my research to understand that we absolutely need strategies, long-term strategies.
Mm,
Yes, we need short-term tactics, but we're all over the place. And when I say we, I mean those of us who want to have a more equitable, more sustainable,
mhm.
more joyful, really, world and life. Uh, but the problem is that we don't have a frame for those. So
Mhm.
the environmental movement is over here, the women's movement is over there, the men's movement is over here, the racial justice movement is over there. Um, it's all within the partnership domination scale. So that's a problem, but we have to have short-term work. We have to do it. But then my research, and really, if you think about it, you can see it in what those pushing us back who have a unified domination frame
Mhm.
focus on. Family and childhood is the first goal. And this they've invested, I mean, look at today, how much energy goes into parental control. That's the beginning, isn't
Right.
it? And I was interviewed for the Scientific American um, relatively recently, actually, and you can find it by just entering my name in Google and Scientific American.
Mhm.
But it is an article uh, really interviewing me, and one of the points that is made in that article is that trauma, which thank goodness we're beginning to talk about, like the ACEs studies, the
Mhm.
adverse childhood experiences studies,
Yes.
even in these United States, where genital mutilation and child brides and a lot of terrible stuff isn't normal, right? Isn't a cultural tradition. We have tremendous childhood trauma, and it is that trauma, if it's very severe, that keeps people really in denial, like climate change denial,
Mhm.
like COVID-19 denial, like election result denial. These are patterns. Uh, so we have the first cornerstone is childhood and family. The second, and they're all interconnected, is gender. Why do they pay so much attention to having rigid gender stereotypes? That this is what men are like and this is what women are like. Well, for one thing, unless you have very rigid gender stereotypes, you can't rank one over the other. And you also, this denial that there is anything in between is part of it. But we, on the more, shall we say, progressive side, have been also taught to marginalize gender as, quote, just a women's issue or just a gender issue. No, as I said before, it is a primary family, social, and economic organizing principle. And that takes me to the third cornerstone that we have to really pay attention to, which is economics. And this whole argument between capitalism and socialism is again a distraction. Look, both capitalism and socialism came out of early industrial times in the 1700s and the 1800s. We are now in the 21st century post-industrial era. So on that count alone, these old operating systems would be antiquated.
Right.
There's much more. And really we have to go deeper to see it. Both capitalism and socialism actually challenged a tradition of domination, top-down economic control. Smith challenged mercantilism, the control of kings and so-called nobles, and then Marx came along and he challenged the bourgeoisie. Uh, and this was in the time of the beginning of the robber barons, a very brutal capitalist time. Um, but they both, and this is what we have to understand. Yes, we need a free market. We don't happen to have one. And yes, we need enlightened government policies. But what we don't need, and we have to unpack, is the hidden system of gendered values.
Mm,
Because if you really analyze, and my book, The Real Wealth of Nations, um, introduces what I know is desperately needed, a caring economics of partnerism
mhm,
that gives value and rewards the most important and uniquely human work of caring for people starting at birth and caring for our natural life support systems. Now, cap capitalism and socialism perpetuated this hidden system of gendered values for both Smith and Marx. The work of caring for people starting at birth, that that was supposed to be done for free by a woman in a male-controlled household.
mm,
So much so that as late as when Marx wrote, in most jurisdictions, a wife, and most women were wives, could, because, professions were closed, education was
right,
closed. I mean, we really have to learn our history and not just in Women's History Week, which is
right,
ridiculous. But what happened is that most jurisdictions had laws that where a wife could not sue for injuries negligently inflicted on her. Only her husband could for loss of her services. I
right.
mean, think about that. And that has transferred into how we measure our metrics, because GDP and GNP, well, both Marx and Smith divided work into productive, that was what men usually did, and just reproductive. And guess what? So it left, so those old models leave out the three life-sustaining sectors of the economy, the non-monetized ones. And there's no reason they shouldn't be, by the way. The natural economy, the volunteer, community economy, and the household economy.
Mm,
I mean, I could go on, but you just read The Real Wealth of
yeah,
Nations, because we need a different economic paradigm. And
yeah,
and this argument is a distraction between capitalism and socialism.
indeed.
I mean, of course we need markets, but as I said, we don't happen to have a free one, and
Yeah,
can't in a, I mean, whether it's domination economics
right.
that
And what was
is
the
the
fourth
problem.
pillar? I got the
Oh, the
three. What was
fourth
the fourth
pillar, the
one?
fourth pillar is stories and language.
Oh, yes.
Well, I mean, think about the stories, the normative stories, whether it's selfish genes or whether it's uh, 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 what is the religious story? It's that we are born, right? Original sin.
Right,
Now they fight each other, but it's the
right,
same story.
right. Interesting.
It's
Yeah,
the same story. We're bad. We need to be rigidly controlled from the
right,
top, as in God fearing.
right. Yeah,
So it all falls into place.
yeah,
Um, well, there's so much, but I want to talk about one thing that I am very deeply involved in.
sure.
I think that in order to destabilize and end traditions of domination, we must start in families. And so I think that the violence of spanking, the violence of using, I mean, that's built into domination families,
Yeah, yeah,
and it has to stop. And we
yeah.
need religious leaders to finally stop talking about violence only in terms of peace internationally, and look at where it all starts. I mean, what do children learn
Yeah.
when there is violence, spanking in our family?
Totally
They
get
learn
that.
that it's okay, it's even moral and much less normal for somebody who is bigger and stronger to use violence
Yeah,
against somebody who is smaller and
absolutely.
weaker. and they also learn to devalue care
Right.
in terms of gender, you know.
Well, that's what I've been trying to teach as a therapist and marriage and family counselor. That's what I do in my day-to-day work with people. And it has to happen not only at the individual level and the family level, but community level and the institutional level. And that's what you've so beautifully described for so many years. And I'm so glad that you're still alive and kicking and still doing the work. And I feel blessed to be able to continue talking with you and interviewing you. And hopefully we can continue doing this together as long as we can keep active and involved. And I look forward to doing this again in the next year or two or whatever time would be appropriate for us to get together again.
Well, thank you. And it's really a pleasure to be with you. And I think that the men's movement uh, and redefining, quote, masculinity is integral to this campaign that I now want to launch and help launch. I'm working with people who have connections with both religious and secular groups.
Oh, good.
But I
Good.
think with 80 to 90% of the world's people identifying with some kind of religion, we've got to get religious leaders to change their view, which is
Yes,
tunnel vision. And yes,
exactly.
I mean, the Pope uh, is a candidate for this, even though he has such a blind spot when it comes to women also being leaders in the church. He's trying to maneuver his way around it, I guess.
Yeah.
But this is a no-brainer.
Well, let's
Family
keep it going.
violence has to go.
Yeah.
Family violence is, and I'm really, really close with that. You know that Putin in 2018 substantially reduced the penalty, the legal penalty for family violence in Russia.
Mm,
This is a nation where femicide is
yeah.
out of bounds, but he gets the connection
Yeah. Yeah.
between a punitive, highly violent and punitive, authoritarian, rigidly male-dominated family, and a rigidly violent, male-dominated, authoritarian state.
Exactly.
And we have to get it because the people pushing us back get it.
Exactly. Not only there, but in our own country, we have to be aware of this everywhere. And certainly where we are here in the United States, it's happening here as well.
It's happening worldwide. Well, I mean, this takes me to cultural transformation theory
Yeah.
another time.
Another time. Well, we'll definitely do this another time. So I want to thank you for today and let's definitely stay in touch. I'll be, putting more things out with you and sharing with you. So for today, thank you again, Rayan, for being with me and look forward to doing this again in the near future.
Thank you, and keep up your important work.
Thank you.